Muhami Matters with Chris Adams, powered by CJA Consulting.
All of these, generally speaking, will be cheaper than ADGM or DIFC.
So when it comes to structuring corporate vehicles like SPVs or crafting shareholders agreements, what's the one principle you believe that the founders or investors must get right from day one?
They're developing so quickly. This is a plus and a minus. It's a plus in the sense that almost every week there's something new and something innovative.
Welcome to Muhami Matters, where credibility meets clarity in legal and professional services. I'm your host, Chris Adams, founder of Muhami and CJA Consulting. Today, we're exploring a vital topic for anyone building or advising businesses in the Middle East and particularly in the UAE. How to structure effectively in the UAE's legal landscape, whether you're launching a firm, managing capital, or expanding regionally. For free zones like ADGM and DIFC to fund structures and cross-border wealth strategies, we're going to cover it all. I'm joined by someone who sits truly at the intersection of legal innovation and business strategy, having done both, Nick Davies, Managing Partner of SBL International. With a background spanning magic circle firms, offshore companies and firms, and now fund licensing in the UAE, Nick brings a nuanced view on what works and what doesn't when building resilient structures. So without further ado, let's get started. So Nick, you've worked across global centres in various different types of companies, from international law firms, magic circle firms, offshore corporate fund companies. What brought you to the UAE and why cross-border advisory in particular?
It's a good question. And, if I were to think back to 2006, when I first qualified as an English lawyer with Linklaters, and I was followed the relatively traditional route of being a British citizen, an English qualified lawyer, trainee in London, spent a 6-month seat in Amsterdam, spent some time in Moscow, but relatively standard for what everyone was doing then. And then I had an opportunity to move to Moscow on a long-term arrangement. Long-term turned out to be 8 years of time. So it turned out to be a very long time. And, back in those days, Moscow was a very different proposition to what it is today. That was one of the hottest places, figuratively speaking, definitely not climate-wise, but from a business sense that actually one could be based in at that time. International investment from, of course, the West, as we would now describe it, but actually from all over. It was a kind of hub for a lot of different businesses. And, as well as that being an amazing experience and a place in which I met my wife, and we now continue to have a lot of family ties, and I have a great affinity for Russia as a country in terms of culture, business, certainly elements of the business and its potential opportunity, notwithstanding any discussion of political matters and geopolitical matters as they may currently stand. But just as a country and a culture and a history, it's a super interesting place to be in and learn. And, I would had that interest, but that really kind of whetted my appetite for exploring personally, but also on a business sense, actually, what is possible and what to do in these interesting and more innovative, more emerging areas of the world. So from Moscow via a 2-year stint in Jersey, and we'll come on to all this a bit later, into Hong Kong, where we spent another 6 years, my family and I, of our life, a very enjoyable 6 years in Hong Kong. And then we moved to the UAE in 2010. So why did we move here? Well, partly, to be honest, it was driven by certain family concerns, post-COVID and various things that we had to deal with. So there's always that element to these things. But it was also an opportunity. As we discussed at the beginning, there was the political noise around the connections between the two places. I was lucky enough at the time to be a partner of RAKEZ, the global offshore firms.
Yes.
A firm that has a very substantive office in Hong Kong, but also a significantly sized for an offshore firm office in Dubai. So that facilitated a kind of ease of move while still running my Hong Kong business and my Hong Kong team, but from here. So to be perfectly frank, there was a lot of synergies on a personal firm level that allowed us to do it. And so I would like to be able to say to you now, it was a master plan that I had always planned to go to these various places and to end up by 2022 in the UAE. But in fact, it was driven solely really by personal and family concerns. And then my firm at the time being able to facilitate that as a reality. And then as these things often happen, you find the doors open, you're in one place or another, your conversations, and then it leads into creating our own firm together with my partners, and then really seeing the potential, as we will come on to, of the connections between the UAE and Asia, and being in a somewhat unique position as a result to be able to capitalize on that.
So I've known you for a little while, and you've always struck me as being very entrepreneurial. So maybe there's been a little bit of a good luck that you've, as you've spoken about, everything's fallen into place. But I understand you're also involved in setting up a licensed fund manager in the UAE. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so you're right. It's opportunities come along from time to time, actually very frequently, to be honest, in the UAE. Almost every day is a different conversation, a different experience. But in terms of the big picture things that I'm doing together with a variety of different partners. So the law firm SBL International is the key one. I founded that with 3 other partners that I've known a long time, all top quality lawyers, ex-global firm partners, and with the firm intention, and it's been borne out in what we've done so far, of delivering premium quality legal services. So Magic Circle, top global law firm, top global offshore law firm, quality services. And bear in mind, before I went offshore, I spent a long time in the same Magic Circle firms, going all the way through the kind of career ladder there. So that is integral to what we do. But at the same time, we're not trying to create the new Freshfields or the new Linklaters. As amazing as those firms are, you're right. We are very entrepreneurial. We're trying to do something very different.
Yeah.
So we see the opportunity to create, and this is literally what we're doing now, create a boutique premium end law firm offering. That position is where we've evolved from. So that's our starting point. But then, I have some other business interests, other business partners. And one of the opportunities we explored very carefully and then managed to we were lucky enough to attract a couple of investors into, was to build a fund management business. Now, as you said, I spent a lot of time also offshore, and a lot of that is focused on particularly Cayman Islands investment fund structures and investment structures more generally, including corporate structures and JBs and so on. And so with the other partners, it's a business which is called Sandrock Capital. We just about touch not wood to receive 2 licenses, one in ADGM and one in DIFC. ADGM to be a full, what they call category 3C fund manager, and in DIFC to be a 3C VC or venture capital fund manager.
Okay.
And so, if you bear in mind what I said a few moments ago about everything comes from this starting point of being a premium quality law firm. That's the day job. That's the main focus. But working with the Sandrock guys over there, it became apparent to us that there was an opportunity to connect in some form these 2 businesses to create a bigger opportunity. And that opportunity, as we see it, is to create a full service funds platform. So Sandrock will have its own funds to start. And SBL as a law firm will help service that in terms of the legal work that goes around that, both in terms of setup and ongoing stuff. So, we have a law firm over here. We have a licensed fund manager over there that will, in due course, be able to service third-party clients as well as managing its own funds. And then in the middle, there's a universe of fund administration, corporate services, and so on. And so we've created the kind of outline of a platform. We have a strategic business plan to expand in those areas. So legal, corporate services, fund admin, third-party fund management. As all these things do, it takes a fair amount of time in terms of the regulatory burden, getting through all the hoops that are required there in the building and getting the right people in place and everything else. But ultimately, we believe we can put together an innovative premium end boutique offering that will capture all of the kind of services that a fund manager in a commercial sense rather than a registered fund manager here, so a foreign fund manager would need if they were looking to establish their first fund, let's say in ADGM or DIFC, or we can assist with certain aspects with Cayman funds or via contacts with Luxembourg funds.
Amazing. Fantastic. So that, yes, I think no entrepreneur can do it by themselves. So I think you made your own luck in many ways. Yeah. You met some great people you can work with.
Yeah. And I think, Chris, that's a very, very important point. It's easy. Everyone says it, but I think it would be fair to say one of the very first things we learned, me and my various partners is the importance of team and having the right people, and not assuming that to any extent we can do it ourselves or do anything particularly well, other than maybe the one now area in which we have a lot of experience in. But part of what I think we've done very well so far is, in fact, doing that, meeting people, finding the right people, bringing people together, creating the team, and then giving people the autonomy to be able to, within their sphere, be able to do what they need to do, the support, the backing, but also the freedom to be able to do that. That's a really big part of our ethos, really. And I think you're absolutely right. Without having the right people, the right team, it's not possible to do anything. With the right people, suitably empowered, you can do anything.
So you mentioned before that you've now, I guess, with the funds you've been looking at, the funds business, and with your law firm as well, you've started exploring much more in depth the various jurisdictions, UAE free zones. So I think we should have a look at a little bit about DIFC versus ADGM. What you're talking about, more sophisticated entities, and those are a bit larger. So let's break down the UAE free zones a bit. At a high level, how do ADGM and DIFC compare?
So at a high level, they're actually very similar. So if you think about the evolution of these, the story starts with DIFC, the Dubai International Financial Center. It is, give or take, 20 years old now. Mm-hmm. It started as a real estate play, so to a decent extent it still is. The jurisdiction exists as a landlord,
yes,
as much as it does as an innovation of business and so on. But that now is a little unfair in the sense that it is actually a jurisdiction in its own right, exploring as such, a jurisdiction for international business. But I think it's always worth remembering that that's how it started. It started by trying to get international businesses into a newly created office zone. And what was one of the key things they offered in order to attract that business? It was almost like, without a real estate angle, almost like the evolution that Cayman Islands or BVI or Jersey or Guernsey went on in the creation of their financial services industries, which is taking effectively the best parts, if we can put it this way, of English law, adjusting it to suit the environment in which they found themselves and the needs of clients, and trying to, straddle that line to balance between sufficiently robust regulation that gives investors and others, just people using the jurisdiction, sufficient confidence that it will work, but not too much regulation that it becomes very difficult to do.
That's entrepreneurial, yes.
And, this is one of the key, people talk of tax and other things, but one of the key reasons for the longevity of say, Cayman Islands in let's say, the funds industry. It's all about getting this balance correct. Mm-hmm. And so DIFC started as, on the one hand, real estate, but how do you attract people in? It's following this approach and having this balance. So DIFC works such that it has its own legal system, which is heavily influenced by, and it, in some cases, imports English law. Now, if we fast forward very approximately, let's say 10 years, what do Abu Dhabi do? Abu Dhabi say, we need some of this. Let's set up our own one. Let's have a look at what DIFC have done, and let's do it a bit better.
Yes.
And I'm not saying one is better than the other, because of course they naturally also compete. But, the DIFC has done a lot of things extremely well during that initial period and continues to do so. So ADGM looks at this and they say, okay, well, look, maybe we can go with a slightly different approach, which is let's just wholesale import English law, and then let's disapply certain bits that are not relevant, and then let us, have our own statutes for important things around, for example, regulation, financial services regulation, companies law, trusts, and so on and so forth. So it's a little bit of a hybrid of the approach. So rather than just saying we have to create it, and say, well, actually, we'll start with what people generally is an international, global, rules of commerce. English law tends to be a preferred jurisdiction. So let's start with that, but then let's take a similar approach in that we have to evolve it to fit with what we want it to work for our constituents, who are going to use it. ADGM is much smaller still than DIFC, but growing extremely. I think it caters to a slightly different audience from DIFC. One of my partners describes DIFC as the kind of international Grand Bazaar which means in a very positive sense. By the way.
Yes.
As in, people come from all over the world. This is a place in which you can transact business. There's a certainty of outcome as regards regulation, as regards disputes and so on. It's a very popular, it's very international. Yeah. ADGM, on the other hand, it's a little bit quieter. If you go down there, it's physically quieter. You know, the very nice shopping mall there, it's much quieter than it is over in DIFC.
Very relaxing, I find. Very vast, serene.
Absolutely, yeah. It's growing very rapidly with the expansion into Al Reem Island. Mm-hmm. So on a footprint basis,
yes,
I would not be surprised actually if ADGM is technically bigger than DIFC.
I think it would be, yeah.
DIFC 2 and then 3 are coming online soon, which means, the flip-flops between the two, DIFC will be bigger again. But ADGM has a very different feel. It's more private capital. It's more discrete capital. It's more regional capital. By regional, Abu Dhabi money, of course, but also the GCC. This, not a hard rule, but there tends to be more of an attraction or an affinity towards ADGM over DIFC for that, kind of capital base. If you're looking at Asia, for example, by which I mean East Asia and Southeast Asia, I would say DIFC is today more known, certainly, without a doubt, but also more popular, maybe partly as a result, but also they feel like maybe a little bit more comfortable in that kind of more international setting. But ADGM is also quite quickly catching up, and it's got 10 years, DIFC's got 10 years on it.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's a very long-winded way of saying that both are very interesting. Both have a lot of similarities. They're the only two financial free zones in the UAE, which means they're the only ones that are permitted as a matter of UAE federal law to independently regulate financial services businesses. So outside of these two, you're dealing with ESCA and the UAE federal regulators. So this is different.
Yes.
They're the only two that are wholesale in different ways, as we discussed, but are wholesale effectively based on an English law product for everything that's non-criminal. So everything in the civil law space, this is what you're dealing with. So these two are the flagship jurisdictions, I would say, today of the UAE when you're looking at international investors. Certainly sophisticated structures, funds, big corporate structures, this sort of thing, but also increasingly for private capital, private wealth. You think of things like foundations and so on, which are popular products in DIFC and ADGM, to give one example of an area in which they've done. And, that's a very interesting point as well, because what has happened, I mentioned at the beginning of this very long answer that DIFC and ADGM, as is the case as well, are real estate plays first and foremost, but they are increasingly evolving to be international jurisdictions in their own right. And that is the declared direction of travel for both. So what you see in both of these jurisdictions now is a full range of structuring products, if we can put it that way, whether it's a fund structure you're looking at, whether it's a corporate structure you're looking at, whether it's a private wealth structure you're looking at, or otherwise. Everything you would see, for example, in, let's say, Cayman Islands, everything you could get there, the idea is, and it's true, you can get in DIFC or ADGM. What they have a bit differently from, and everything has its place, yeah? But what they have a little bit differently from, say, Cayman or BVI is a significant amount of substance on the ground here in terms of what you need, and the rules require it, by the way, what you need in terms of substance for your structure, but also in terms of professional services, so not just legal services or regulated services, but accountants, corporate service providers, all, even shops and everything that you need if you're going to move staff here. You have everything that you need, and then obviously in the wider UAE as well. So they're in a very interesting place, both of these jurisdictions, because they have an opportunity to continue to play the real estate angle. But I think over time that will become less and less important to these jurisdictions. And you see it now in the change of regulation, where, registered offices can be provided for certain structures by CSPs, or flexi desks are a very popular solution to a lot of things that wouldn't have been the case a few years ago in ADGM or DIFC. So this change, this evolution through over time as they become really international structuring jurisdictions in their own right. That applies regionally to the MENA region, let's say. It's definitely becoming more popular in the Far East. And I believe we will see that coming through, Africa and globally as it goes, because, if nothing else, we're not flat earthers here, but if you look at a flat map, it's right in the middle, right?
Yes.
It's always sort of inside hub. Think of the airlines. They make it like literally a transport and logistical hub. It's relatively easy to get here from more or less anywhere. And so tax is relatively straightforward. So everything kind of lends itself to this. And that's also what attracted us from our own personal business sense into setting up not only headquartering our law firm here, and we are working right now actually on a presence in Hong Kong as well, but the hub, the HQ will remain in the UAE, but also on the fund management side. Again, we're looking at doing something in Hong Kong. Being in the UAE is the key to everything, and that's the way we see it will grow.
So speaking of the UAE, would you look for these sort of more complex structures beyond ADGM and DIFC? Is there anywhere else that you would be suitable?
It's a good question. And, ADGM and DIFC, I'm an English lawyer first and foremost, so I have an affinity with places that I fully understand, to just be blunt about it. And I spent a lot of time in the offshore world as well, which work, and as we just discussed, in a similar way to the evolution that we're seeing with ADGM and DIFC. I have an inclination towards those, but they're not always the answer. Firstly, they're more expensive than other options in the UAE. They're more regulated, which, as we were talking about before, can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on what you're doing. They are not, it is fair to say right now, although they're working on it, as quick. In terms of getting a structure to market, they're not as quick as, say, you establish that in Hong Kong, or you establish that in Luxembourg, or even England, and certainly not as quick as Cayman or BVI or Jersey or something like that.
Yeah.
So there's a way to go in these things, and this is a competitive world, right? There's stuff to be done. There are still hangovers of a more bureaucratic time here that we see elsewhere that's still applying DIFC and ADGM, and this causes log jams from time to time, and you still need to interface. They're not a complete island in and of themselves. You still need to interface. For example, if you want to bring people in, you've got to deal with immigration and visas and whatnot.
Yes.
So, there are issues with them. But what I've seen even in 3 years is how quickly that is changing.
There's a lot of evolution.
Yeah, if we're speaking in 2 years' time, I suspect ADGM will look very different again. But you're right, they're not the only options out there. In fact, there are 40-odd free zones in the UAE. Many of them started with a particular focus. DMCC commodities, for example, or a local regional focus, such as RAKEZ, which is Ras Al Khaimah's economics, and obviously centered around the infrastructure and stuff they have up there. At least that was the starting point. But now, actually, many of them cater to general business in quite a broad range of situations. Trade licenses are available that cover. They may have some specific nuances for their jurisdiction, but largely cover all of the general trading activities that many businesses would do, or can cater to some extent for holding company structures. But one still has to be careful as to which you're choosing and why. Pricing can be different. All of these, generally speaking, will be cheaper than ADGM or DIFC, but not always, because ADGM and DIFC have prescribed company DIFC, SPV, ADGM, which, if you're looking at a purely passive holding structure, often is cheaper and definitely more secure in terms of the regulatory piece, the legal piece, how it works, having shareholders agreements, this sort of thing, than it would be in another free zone. So it all depends on what a client is looking to achieve. But there are definitely circumstances in which it makes sense to not be an ADGM or DIFC, but to set up in a Maidan. We have some companies, and my wife has some companies there, RAKEZ. On a business level, we use RAKEZ a lot, and we like them very much. DMCC, DWTC, the list goes on. There can be reasons to use any of these depending on what you're doing.
Are there any recurring misconceptions or surprises you come across when advising on where to set up and how to structure?
Yes. So a couple of things I would just highlight. There are packages, there are incentives, there are various things that go on. But there needs to be at least an analysis done of the regulatory position in each of the free zones. Some of them are now quite well developed and work well. As I mentioned before, we like RAKEZ, for example. It's not necessarily one on the top of people's lists. We find it a very efficient free zone for certain uses. Very sophisticated corporate services business, as in the regulator, the regulatory side. They're very good there. They're very quick. Much quicker, actually, than a lot of the other free zones. So, understanding these things, it's not immediately apparent. It's like anything, if you Google it, you will find all the advertising, the marketing stuff, all the stuff that you know how to do so well, Chris. But speaking to somebody who understands them and has experience in them a little bit can help a lot. And the other thing to watch out for is, some of these free zones, let's say the company's regulation, it may be 20 pages long, or exaggerating a bit, but you get the point. And outside of this, remembering what we said before, only ADGM and DIFC have been ring fenced as a matter of federal law to have their whole kind of ecosystem. The others will fall back into UAE
To mainland
law.
yes.
Exactly, to mainland law, where outside of these narrow regulatory pieces, and that's not always understood. So it may be fine today when you're setting up your company, but what happens if there's a dispute, for example? And some people want it. It depends again what the client wants, but are you comfortable in being in a kind of UAE disputes world? For some people, that's perfect, exactly what they want. Other people, maybe not so much. So there's all these different kind of nuances that need to be considered when you're looking at it. And the final thing I would say is don't necessarily discount mainland now. That used to be quite difficult, right? Because you also had the prohibition on majority foreign ownership for practically all structures. You had to have a nominee shareholder for many things. That's now changed since 2020, where 100% foreign ownership is possible for structures in many industries, undertaking many trade activities. Though, of course, still ones that are ring-fenced, typically for national security reasons or political reasons, which is the same as you would find in any country that you deal with where there are going to be restrictions around certain industries. But outside of that, and this has blurred the distinction a little bit between mainland and free zone, is actually the mainland can still be an option.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have to consider tax, and is it better in the free zone? So now we have corporate tax versus the mainland, and there are some distinctions depending on the size of business, some distinctions that can be made there. So proper tax advice then becomes important. But that's a little bit more of a burden, a mainland company, in terms of the regulation, and in terms of you have to have an office within the Jari, for example, in Dubai, to give a local example, which requires you to have a 12-month lease. So there's a lot of things, but there may be a big positive in that. Depending on what you're doing, you can service clients anywhere in the UAE from a mainland company. So there's a lot of different factors at play depending on what an individual client's doing.
He touched a little bit on potential disputes. Does that play a big part? Judicial enforceability, the ability to access English law, for example, from ADGM or DIFC. Are these big factors in the decision-making as to what to do?
I mean,
what to structure?
To be frank, not always, but they probably should be most of the time. As is human nature, right? And often the case that people maybe come together to put in place a particular structure, not necessarily because you don't want to, right? Thinking about what happens if this all goes wrong.
Yeah.
Their advisors are trying to tell them, but it's not necessarily front and center. And of course, that's absolutely understood. But at the same time, it is important to consider these matters. And as we said before, depending on who the client and their counterparties are and what they're looking to achieve, one or other may make sense. So, for example, I always go back to ADGM and DIFC because it's what I know well. There, you have you don't have absolute certainty of outcome. Otherwise, there would be no point of ever having any dispute resolution proceedings. But you do have certainty of the application of the law and how that will work in terms of your dispute. And you have the potential to enforce a judgment from those places in, say, the mainland. On the other hand, it may be that a different set of circumstances warrants something that's closer to the UAE civil law, originally based on Egyptian civil law and well understood, in the region. Language may play a piece there, although you can do things, of course, in Arabic in DIFC and ADGM as well. But everything on that level will be in Arabic if you're in the UAE mainland system. Again, for some people that they would rather not. For other people, that's a big plus. So it all depends on what's required. But I think it would be fair to say generally that's, with obvious exceptions, that's not always given the thought perhaps it should be at the beginning of setting up structures.
Yeah, so I think that makes me think that importance of having proper advisors from the beginning is really important. So obviously you're a lawyer, and lawyers I know play a massive role, almost a leadership role, I think, in
I think that's right.
setting up these structures and in making sure everything runs smoothly and making sure that there are protections through the future. What advisors should companies or investors look to get on board?
Yeah, so of course I would say legal advice, but you wouldn't expect me to say anything different. That's always key wherever you're doing stuff in the world.
Absolutely.
He understands that. Tax, the one thing we can be sure of that doesn't go away is taxes.
Yes.
And even here, I say even here because a few years ago there was really no tax regime at all. then VAT, then now corporate tax. And this is also, and I'm by no means a tax expert, but this is also evolving quickly. The FTA, Federal Tax Authority, is becoming very sophisticated in its understanding and an application, changing and developing of the rules to basically create internationally recognized tax regime. That's going to become more and more important domestically, but also, as we were talking about before, more and more international structures are being hubbed here. Or what are the international tax implications if you're dealing with the US, to give an obvious example of an area which needs very detailed advice. But practically anywhere you deal today, you need to have the cross-border tax piece. I think that's absolutely crucial in more or less anything that you do, from corporate stuff to private client, whatever. That's absolutely key. Of course, accountants and so on as well, getting all that right and being clear on how it works. And then the other one I would mention, which again is not always thought about, it's a little bit dependent again on the individual circumstances, is good immigration advice. So for example, if you're looking to move to the UAE and you're thinking about setting up a corporate structure, you will have a visa through this. Okay, that is quite a normal route, but checking exactly what it works or what you can do or you can't do on it. Can you bring dependents? How does this work? How do you sponsor people? Or something that people ask about a lot is, how do I get into the golden visa regime? And of course, you can do it through property in various ways, but if you're thinking of doing it, for example, on the basis of having employment, which is a route many people take, and there used to be 6 months and now it's a year or 2 years, depending where you're looking, of seeing a certain level of employment and salary coming in order to apply for it. But actually there are quite strict rules now. Yes. And if you don't get that right at the beginning, you're going to have spent all this time and then find you're not eligible, for example. So having that sort of advice, around the side or on the sides of what you're doing, if that is relevant to your structure, is also key, I think.
Okay, so lawyers, tax advisors, funds managers, and immigration specialists.
Exactly. Just to start.
I guess that, exactly, just to start.
I think there's a business idea in here somewhere, Chris.
I'm just writing this down just at the moment, just in case. But I think you might be 2 steps ahead of me, Nick, I'm afraid, on that side of things. So when it comes to structuring corporate vehicles like SPVs or crafting shareholders agreements, what's the one principle you believe that the founders or investors must get right from day one?
Being very clear on what ultimately you're looking to achieve, which sounds like a stupid, obvious thing to say. But even from my own personal experience as a lawyer and actually doing the business stuff as well, I can say from both sides, having a clear view of where you're trying to go to. And the reason I say this is, and lawyers are particularly guilty of this often, is, there's very often things become overcomplicated in terms of the documentation, but in terms of the structuring, anything, because there's a misconception as to where we're trying to actually get to. If it's clear what the commercial rationale is, between the party, what they look to do, and it's something, by the way, at SBL, we push very hard. Very often things can be made more simple rather than more complex. And one of the ways in which we have, I think so far in our kind of early history of our business, one of the ways in which we've managed to attract and retain clients is by, instead of saying, oh, well, we could do a 200-page shareholders agreement and it will cost X. We say, well, actually, is it what you need? Because let's break down what actually this arrangement is and what you're trying to do.
That's the importance of a good advisor, I think.
And, this could be...
What do you need? Yeah.
What do you need? This could be done more simply. Okay, we get lower fees today, but I believe that is a big win for tomorrow because you get now a client that, trusts you, that looks to your advice, knows that you have their back as well. And we want to work with clients that we like and we know we can add value. So we are actually selective on our clients, even though we're a new business and there's a temptation, of course, like any business owner, to try and grab as much as you can. But we think actually the better way is to do this, take this approach, work with people, understand their businesses, understand where they're trying to get to, and advise them accordingly, regardless of our immediate fee income as a result, which can be therefore lower, because it builds a long-term relationship and we will win, both sides will win in the longer term. So it sounds a bit glib, but it is actually what we do. So my answer to your question is just be very clear on where you're trying to get to and start from this premise rather than trying to reverse engineer it.
So thinking about funds, we're seeing an increased interest in UAE domiciled funds. What types of fund structures are most commonly used in ADGM and DIFC today?
It's a good question. And I think if we're to be entirely honest, where we are right now in both is at the beginning of the funds story. If you contrast it with Cayman, which I always look back on, or Luxembourg, where we do a lot of stuff, jurisdictions that have grown in the fund space. Because Bermuda before Cayman, but Cayman over the last 30 years, Luxembourg, a similar time frame, maybe slightly longer. They're now very sophisticated with a lot of funds. Firstly, a lot of assets under funds under management there, but also a sophistication of regulation structures and so on. Here, it really is the start of the story. So the numbers are increasing a lot, but increasing from a low base in terms of setup of funds and whatnot. And a significant number remain, sovereign wealth or publicly, as in government-owned funds and so on. But the position is changing quickly.
Yes.
So the good news is, more or less any structure you might see used internationally can be applied here. So GPLP structures, and that's probably what we see most commonly now. So simple limited partnership structure. I say simple, it can actually be extremely complicated, but simple in terms of its concept, General partner, limited partners, probably still the most common one that we see. And actually that will probably remain the case because that's the norm in the, if we can call it this, the private funds world. Used to be kind of closed-ended, but now, there's a little bit more of a hybrid with redemption gates and things. But, that private equity, private funds world, that structure works here and works well. There's also corporate structures. We see PCC structures, and that's becoming more and more protected style company, becoming more popular. It's broadly similar to the Cayman SPC. So, a lot of kind of mutual fund structures, for example, maybe looking at that. And so I suspect, because there's no point to reinvent the wheel, as more and more business comes through here, so it will follow a similar approach that we've seen in more developed fund jurisdictions of using a variety of these products, depending on, firstly, what you're trying to achieve, but also on what is normal in your segment of the market, which is, as always, very often it's easier because investors expect a certain thing rather than explain a different structure to follow what is the norm in that
what's
space.
been done, yeah.
And all of that can be done. One thing that I think is interesting here, and again, it's not a new thing, you can find them in many jurisdictions, is the ICC, Incorporated Cell Company here. So you have a company in each of the cells, like a PCC, but each of these cells are now effectively separate mini companies, separate legal personality within this umbrella structure. Now here, to do that right now, you need a platform endorsement from the regulator. Now we're talking about DIFC and ADGM. But they're interesting structures that we've seen, and they actually lend themselves to what I was talking about right at the beginning with Sandrock around, or having the potential to provide a hosting structure, a third-party structure with the right endorsements from the regulator. That is something I think will become quite popular here because there are quite large barriers to entry. That platform structure, the ICC platform structure, is something I think we will see used more and more here for the right people offering the right services.
So I guess those who have looked at all their options and decide, we're not going to go with Cayman or Luxembourg, we're going to look to the UAE instead. What are the top considerations for fund managers or family offices in setting up UAE investment vehicles?
I think first and foremost, considering why you want to do it in the UAE. So of course, I'm flying the flag for particularly ADGM and DIFC, but the UAE more generally, including back in Hong Kong. And I firmly believe, as we keep coming back to, of this direction of travel that we're on here, and it's going to grow into this thing. But it is still relatively early. And so is it the right place? They're developing so quickly that this is a plus and a minus. It's a plus in the sense that almost every week there's something new and something innovative, a new license and so on. But actually license is probably a good word to highlight in that it's still quite a regulatory intensive environment here to get set up.
Yes.
It's not as quick to market as other places right now. It's not as cheap. There are still real estate considerations to have, all of which might be perfectly acceptable, in fact desirable for some clients, but not necessarily for others. Is there a better place to do this today with maybe a plan to evolve into here later? Is it a Cayman or BVI? Is it a Hong Kong? Is it a European jurisdiction? It depends on what's going on, or a combination of any of these. And a combination is actually a very good point. Does that make sense? Is there a UAE nexus that makes sense, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the whole piece? Do you want to have the jurisdictional concentration of everything in the UAE, or do you want to have, whatever it is, let's say a holding company or maybe a trust somewhere else? Trust is another good example. Foundations, very popular here. Trust, not so much. And, it's not an easy, I'm not a trust lawyer, but it's not an easy part of the law here. There's mainland trust, there's ADGM, DIFC, but very few regulated trust businesses as of now, trust licenses. If you're looking at that sort of thing, does it make sense for now anyway to be somewhere else? And because of that, because the regulatory piece is growing from quite a traditional base, things like trade licenses, everybody has to have a trade license. You have a business registration certificate in Hong Kong. This is nothing new in and of itself, but they're fairly restricted, right? In terms of the activities that you're undertaking, and even more so if it's a regulated activity. And so, even in a non-regulated space, there's quite a lot of restrictions around that. There's a lot of cost to renewals, to changing those. Everything has a cost to change anything. Share capital requirements for certain activities. All of this is fairly old-fashioned, if we can put it that way, compared to maybe some other jurisdictions which have got past a lot of this now. And you can set up a company, and there may be some reporting of what you do, but generally speaking, you can use this company as you see fit within the confines of the law. Not necessarily the case yet here. So these are all things that I think are important. It depends on what you're trying to do, I think.
It brings us back to the importance of having strong advisors, I think, at the beginning. And those immigration advisors and tax advisors and lawyers, obviously, to make sure you've got a full picture.
Yeah.
So just to start to sum us up a bit, for any business leader or investor considering a UAE structure, what's one legal insight you believe stands up above all?
We've kind of discussed, I think, a lot of it. The one thing I would say, and this really comes more from my business experience, and it's just from my business experience here, rather than my legal experience. So I call it the swamp. And it has one, I think, always must be aware of this, which is, bear with me with this analogy, it kind of works. So
my brain is going crazy because swamp monsters or something. Well, I'm looking, getting stuck. Okay.
This is exactly. So you come into the UAE, everything looks very nice and easy. And, this is nothing against the UAE or anything unique. It's just an evolving jurisdiction, right?
Yes.
Let's say you pick, DIFC, and everything looks very easy and straightforward. Everyone will tell you can do this very quickly and so on. And to a large extent, for their bit, it's true. But as we were saying before, there's other bits that go alongside it as well. So you kind of get to the edge of the swamp. This looks easy. I want to go over there. I can do that pretty easily, pretty cost effectively. And then you go in and you find you're in a swamp. You're in a swamp of competing regulatory requirements. Some things are not clear. You're dealing with, as I mentioned, different agencies for different things and so on. And you kind of get to a point, I think, and this is not to put people off because you have to hear the end of it as well. But you get to a point, at this stage where you're like, I wish I could maybe just turn around and go somewhere else. But you're in a swamp now. You can't get out.
Right.
The only way out, you got to go this way. I'm not sure this is exactly how swamp works, but this is in my mind, right? So you have to keep going forward. And wherever you get out the other side, everything becomes straightforward in terms of doing business. Doing business in the UAE is very straightforward, generally speaking, and you get to do what you want. Getting to the point of being able to do business can be a lot more cumbersome and frankly more painful and often more timely and sometimes more costly than people expect it to be. So this is the one thing I would say to watch out, the swamp.
The swamp.
It's often worth going through this swamp, but just bear in mind it's not necessarily as easy to get to the point of doing business as it may appear when you first look at it.
Understood. Okay, so now we're going to finish up with a bit of fun, a rapid quick-fire round.
Let's do it.
So I'll give you a few quick prompts. You can say true or false, or just give us your quick take. True or false? ADGM is only for big international firms.
False.
True or false? DIFC court judgments can be enforced across the UAE.
True.
True or false? You can set up an SPV in just one day.
Disregarding marketing, false.
True or false? You have to be ultra rich to set up a family fund.
False, with some caveats. Very loyally answer there.
Yeah, I understand that one. Okay, quick take. What's one underrated jurisdiction in the UAE?
RAKEZ.
What's the What's the biggest myth about offshore legal structures?
Tax, that they're set up solely for tax avoidance.
And finally, if you weren't a lawyer, Nick, what would you be?
Well, that's an interesting one. I think you can see in where I'm going, the business side is very attractive, business side of law, but not only. And actually where I would most be if I wasn't a lawyer, and something that I'm also involved in, is the sports business, and particularly for youth development. So I have 4 children, 3 boys that are very active football, soccer players. So I have a family reason for being in this, but I very much believe in getting, kids off screens and outside and doing things. My wife is a psychologist and youth mindset training expert. So we both very strongly believe in the importance of mindset training for kids, in sport. Some people obviously become professional sportsmen, many do not. But things like mindset training, something I'm trying to learn now in my mid-40s, to give a child, boy or girl, that insight, that experience, the certain tools, that you use from the beginning. I think whatever they go on to do is crucial. So if I wasn't doing what I'm doing now, I think I would focus full time on the kind of business of sport, but with that mindset training angle for youth.
Amazing. So Nick, thank you for joining us on Muhami Matters today. Your insights have been very insightful, practical and genuinely helpful. So where can our listeners find out more about you and get in touch with you if they want to?
So the usual places, I guess. So we have a website, sblinternational.com. We have as yet very undeveloped social media channels.
You feel like you need a marketing.
I was going to say, I dare say I may know somebody who can assist us with that at very good rates, I believe. And, we have offices in Emirates Towers in Dubai, just next to the DIFC. And we're looking at establishing an Abu Dhabi base very soon. So you can always pick up the phone. You can find out details on our website or come and see us. We're actually very friendly people, and we're keen to meet people looking to do business in the UAE.
Perfect. And you can also find Nick and SBL at muhami.ae as well, just to give ourselves a plug.
Absolutely.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Muhami Matters wherever you find your favorite podcast, or you can even find us on YouTube. For more legal insights and to get in touch with professionals, visit us at muhami.ae. I'm Chris Adams. Until next time, stay informed, stay empowered. Thank you for joining us on Muhami Matters. If you found today's episode valuable, subscribe and connect with me to stay updated. Join me again soon as we continue to bring you credible insights, practical strategies, and trusted advice to empower your professional journey. I'm Chris Adams. Until next time, stay informed and stay empowered.